Book publicity is a mixed bag these days. On the one hand, it's never been easier for an author to form a direct relationship with their audience with tools like Substack and TikTok. On the other hand, more books are published each year than ever before, which means competition is fierce. Most newspapers have laid off most of their book critics, but at the same time, there's an ever expanding ecosystem of podcasts that are eager to have on book authors for long form interviews. Probably nobody is more knowledgeable about marketing books in the modern age than Kathleen Schmidt. She spent nearly 20 years working for almost every major book publishing company, and she now runs her own firm that specializes in book marketing. She also writes Publishing Confidential, her insider account of how the book industry actually functions. In a recent interview, Kathleen walked through every aspect of selling books, from choosing the right cover, to courting influencers, to advertising on Amazon. Hello, I'm Simon Owens, and this is The Business of Content, the show about how publishers create, distribute, and monetize their digital content. If you want to listen to an audio version of this show, subscribe to The Business of Content wherever you get your podcasts. By the way, have you ever wondered how I monetize this show? It's entirely reliant on subscriptions to my Substack newsletter. When you subscribe, you're able to book a half-hour introductory phone call with me. You also receive subscriber-only interviews with some of the world's most successful media entrepreneurs. Support the work I do here by subscribing at simonowens.substack.com. That's simonowens.substack.com. Or just Google the words Simon Owens and newsletter. And finally, if you're on the lookout for interviews with the world's most successful media entrepreneurs about how they built their businesses, then this is the show for you. So take a few moments to hit the subscribe button down below. Okay, let's jump into the interview. Hey, Kathleen, thanks for joining us.
No problem. Thanks for having me, Simon.
So we're having you on today to talk about all the various strategies around marketing a new book, whether it's, self-published or coming from a traditional publisher. But first, I wanted to just kind of run through your background in publishing, because you have worked for all the big publishers, all the big celebrities, and anything like that. How did you break into the industry?
It's actually pretty funny. I always kind of knew I wanted to do something with books, and I wanted to be an editor. So before I graduated college, I sent my resume, and this was like 1995, 1996, so keep that in mind. I sent my resume to, I think it was St. Martin's and another publisher for editorial assistant jobs. And they offered me, I interviewed and I got offers. And the first one was for $15,000 a year. And the second one was for $9,000 a year. And I had student loans looming. So I was like, I can't do that. So
And these were like editorial assistant jobs or something
yeah,
like that?
editorial assistant jobs. And this is back in the day when the New York Times still printed their help want ads. So I was scouring them one Sunday and I came across an ad saying publicity assistant needed for a small publisher in New Jersey, must love pop culture, must have good sense of humor. So I was like, well, that's me. And I interviewed with Carol Publishing, which was an independent publishing house that in Secaucus, New Jersey, with the warehouse attached to it. And I got my first publicity job for $23,000 a year. So at that point, that was a lot of money. I was making more than a lot of my friends in publishing were making. And that's how I broke in. My first big break in that job was working with the Spice Girls on a photo scrapbook that we published. It was just when they were breaking out in the US. So that really was when it took off.
Yeah, I think like a lot of English majors, me included, we think, oh, it would be great to work in publishing, but like it's kind of a black box in terms of how to break into it. And if you don't live in New York, which I didn't, I was in like, rural Pennsylvania, like it was just, so that's how I ended up becoming a newspaper journalist. Cause I was like, what do I do with an English degree? I either become a journalist or I work in book publishing, and I don't live in New York. So, I never went the book publishing route. So that's how you got broken, but you've worked for several major top 5 publisher, like New York publishers, including like Penguin and stuff like that. And you've mainly worked in like some form of publicity or marketing.
Yes, I worked for Dutton Books, which is a part of Penguin, well now Penguin Random House, and Plume, which is the paperback, was the paperback arm of Dutton Books at that time. And then I also worked at Simon and Schuster twice. I worked for Pocketbooks when that existed. Not sure if it still does. And then I went back after my time at Penguin, and I was VP of publicity for Atria Books from 2006 to 2010. And I've done other stints along the way. I was an associate publisher at Rodale Books, which is now with Random House. I was VP of marketing for Running Press, which is in Philadelphia. And then to round things off, I was a literary agent for 3 years, and my last job in-house was as publicity director for Skyhorse Publishing.
Yeah, and as part of your purview, at least in some of your jobs, you actually were in charge of doing publicity for some pretty big celebrities over the years. Some of whom, obviously, not easy to work with, big personalities and stuff like that. So occasionally, that's how you share these stories on social media and stuff like that. When you broke into the industry in 1990s, when you look at that compared today, like what are the biggest shifts in how book publicity, and maybe we're getting a little bit ahead of us because I do want to talk about what you're doing now and stuff like that, but like what do you think like the biggest shifts are in book publicity? Like, is it that authors now have more power to handle their own marketing than ever before, or is it the rise of book talk? Like, what do you feel like is kind of the biggest shift when you think about what you were doing back then versus now?
I think the biggest shift is that now there are more books published than there is media to cover them. And that's a tremendous shift that we've seen. So when I first started out, there were a lot of books still being published, but there was also a ton of media that you could get for them. So one of the earliest books I worked on was I forget the title of it, but it was this guy who assisted his wife in suicide. She was terminally ill, and I got a front page story on the Daily News. That's unheard of. That wouldn't happen today. And I think what we're seeing now with media is the media, journalists are taking the power into their own hands and starting newsletters and starting their own media companies. Authors do have power still, but once they're published by the big five, their power diminishes somewhat. And unless you're a huge New York Times bestselling author, you're not as high up in the ecosystem as you would be otherwise. So yes, book talk has made a difference with some of that, but the biggest shift in what I do is seeing the media shrink and more books get published.
But even as the media is shrinking, do you think that the one kind of upside is like now the authors themselves can become their own media in terms of having a newsletter, having a social media account, just having a constant drumbeat of pressure? Like I don't know how much that, like some people say that, like, obviously like people were getting 10 years ago were getting these huge book deals because they had large Twitter followings,
Mm-mm,
and then now you've seen the backlash of like Twitter doesn't sell books, so
mm-mm.
like maybe we're over exaggerating how much power they actually have. I don't know, where do you kind of fall on that spectrum in terms of the power of the author today versus back then?
I think the power that authors have today is that they can reach their audiences directly, and that wasn't possible back in the 90s. You needed an intermediary to do that. And so therefore, a publicist or at least a marketing person. Today, you can reach your audience directly by having a newsletter, by being on social media. And that is a really valuable aspect of what's happening today in publishing. It's just that I feel and I see a lot of authors still stuck in the mindset of, well, if my book is being published by a publisher, the publisher should control all that stuff. And they're the ones that have to get me media. And they're the ones that have to find my audience. And that's just not true.
Hmm. And they need to think more like entrepreneurs now today more than
Hmm.
ever.
Yeah.
Which leads me to like what you're doing now. So you run your own kind of, I think, one person firm. How long have you been doing that?
2 years. It's PR, marketing, and branding.
Yeah, so it's a full service, like book focused agency that will help them get traditional earned media, but then also help them with their marketing. And then you
Hmm.
said branding. So does that mean like book covers and stuff like that? Like even advising on that kind of stuff?
Yeah, it can. I do that for some clients, but also help them, build community, help them with audience growth. So that to me all falls under branding. So that, depending on what I feel is possible for an author and what they're willing to do, because some people just don't want to be online and you can't force them to be online. I take them and, we talk about what to do to get them to grow their audience, but also just to connect with their audience in a meaningful way that will then translate into sales, hopefully.
And are most of your clients individual authors, or is it the book publisher that's paying you? Like, what's that kind of dynamic?
It's mostly individual authors. I do some stuff for nonprofits that are publishing adjacent, but I would say 99% of my clients are authors.
And of that pie, and then what's the pie chart of self-published versus traditionally published authors that usually take on?
I will take on self-published authors if I feel like they really have something special. So right now I only have one self-published author. I have maybe two hybrid authors. That means that they're paying the publisher to publish their books, and the publisher handles distribution and stuff. And then the rest of them are traditionally published.
Yeah, and so I guess the assumption then is then since the author is the client, they're taking either a part of their advance or dipping into their own
Mhm.
personal wealth to hire you to help them, basically.
Yeah, and I really try to be, aware of the fact that not everybody has a ton of money to pay for publicity. The fees are all over the place for doing what I do. So I try to cater to every kind of budget. But yes, most of the time, authors are either taking from their advances or wherever they're getting income streams from, and they use it to pay publicists.
And then you also run a newsletter that kind of just writes behind the scenes about the
Mhm.
industry. I know there's a pay component of it, but is that mostly kind of like a marketing vehicle for your consulting services?
It can be. I mean, it turned out to be. I didn't intend for it to be. When I first started Publishing Confidential, I tried doing it in 2018 and I did it through MailChimp. I was between jobs and I was kind of in the mindset of, let me see what this would be like if I wrote about the industry in an honest way. And I think I got out 3 issues before I got a job as a literary agent, and then I couldn't do it anymore. So I had like 50 email addresses. And in 2023, I was kind of like, let me see what this Substack is all about. And I went on there. I knew nothing about the platform really. I just knew that it was a good place to do a newsletter. I got my designer to do a logo, and the rest is kind of history. And I just started writing honestly about the industry. And what came from that is people seeking me out for my services. So it was interesting because I didn't even have my website up fully until a year ago. And so the Substack was really the place where people were finding me.
And what's your general sense of the portion of your clients that come in via just more traditional word of mouth and recommendations versus those coming in because of your not just what you're doing with your Substack, but then also posting the threads and stuff like that. Like, do
Mhm.
you obviously you can't track every single thing, but I'm sure you ask people where they come from. So what's kind of that kind of breakdown? Do you think?
They usually tell me, I would say 80% come from the newsletter and 20% come from referrals and things like that.
So that's just a great like marketing vehicle for you.
Yeah, it really is unexpectedly, but yeah.
Okay, so let's get into the meat of this. What I really wanted to have you on to talk about is like some of the strategies that you are the advice that you give to authors. And for kind of the sake of this one, I guess I want to focus on nonfiction versus fiction,
Okay.
because I'm guessing that they're two different beasts. And my
Mhm.
guess is nonfiction is easier to market than fiction. Would I be correct in that assumption?
You would be very correct, yes.
Yeah. And is it because that has more of a news hook, like there's something topical that they could be interviewed about, or people are more likely to share something that's nonfiction versus like a piece of fiction?
Yeah, I mean, the nonfiction that I'm working on right now, I mean, one is a political book that is very in tune with what's going on with the election. So that's, that's easy to pitch. Another one is sort of more in the memoirs, you know, thought leadership category. Um, so when I take on nonfiction, and I do end up doing quite a bit of it, I always look at what is the angle I can pitch here, and how successful will I be given the climate that we're in at any given moment. Because yes, nonfiction is easier to pitch, but no, it's not necessarily easier to get the big media because I feel like we're constantly in a crazy news cycle.
So obviously the judge your book for your by its cover axiom is well known. How much is the book cover? Like what role does that play in terms of sales and marketing?
I think it plays a huge role. I mean, right now we're in a world where covers need to look really good online, and designers take that and publishers take that into consideration when they're designing, book covers. But the other thing is, when you're browsing in a bookstore, that's the first thing you see. And I know if nothing else, I am the ideal consumer because I like stuff, and I will go into Barnes and Noble, and what attracts me to a book is a cover. I could know nothing about the book, and I will go up and read the, jacket copy because I was attracted to the cover. So the cover is one of the biggest elements of marketing a book, and it's super important to get it right.
But like, is it like a more of an art than a science? Because it seems like there are trends within book covers, and
Hmm.
I don't know if this trend is over, but I remember reading about there was like some era where book covers were just like bright colors and splotchy things, and there was nothing illustrative of what was in the book for like.
Yeah.
So is it partly about like, are there universal things, or is it more about like this is what's trendy right now, so people will be attracted to what's trendy?
It's a mix of both. We just came out of the trend of like what you were saying, the different colors, and the title kind of being overwhelmed by the different colors in the background. In the late '90s and early aughts, when women's fiction started blowing up, we would kind of laugh because there was this trend of just a woman's arm or her back or her legs on a book cover, and that was huge, and there were trend stories about it. So there are trends. If they see they're working for certain books, they're going to try and you know kind of stay in the spirit of that. But I'm all for experimentation. I think if you could be different, be different.
Yeah. So, one of the aspects of book publicity involves advanced review copies,
Mhm.
usually referred to as ARCs for short. Is there like what's the kind of these days the kind of average number of ARCs that are printed prior to a book's launch, or is it all over the place?
It's all over the place. It depends on the publisher. So I work with quite a few authors being published by smaller presses, and smaller presses either don't do ARCs, they just do digital ones, or they print a very small amount of them. If you're with a big publisher, they'll print more, but I think since the pandemic, everyone's being kind of conservative with their numbers, because during the pandemic, what publishers, had to do was send everything digitally. And I think that
Because of like
everyone,
supply chain problems and stuff
yeah,
like that.
supply
Yeah.
chain problems, and everybody working from home. So if you wanted to see a book, you had to get it digitally, or someone had to go try to print out a manuscript and, overnight it to someone. But the issue with ARCs is that either too many are printed, too little are printed, or none are printed. And as much as I would like to say media has advanced, reviewers and critics and the like, they still want the printed arcs. They don't want the digital ones. So it's very hard to work with solely digital ones. It's doable, but it's hard. It's hard. And sometimes if it's a hybrid deal where the author is paying the publisher to do this stuff, the author will pay for them themselves. Even in some traditional houses, authors will say, I will pay for extra, ARCs, or I'll pay for ARCs, period. That could happen at a mid-sized publisher.
And what's kind of the upper end of ARCs that are printed, like on like the highest number you'll typically see?
When I worked in house, the highest number I ever saw was 1,500, and that was because it was a big book. The publisher was sending ARCs to all of these trade shows and conferences and stuff, and really putting everything out there. Normally, I would say these days probably about 150, 200.
Hmm. So, as the publicist, who's probably kind of the quarterback in terms of distributing these ARCs, what is your kind of strategy in terms of how far in advance you're sending them out, and what kind of the breakdown is in terms of traditional book reviewers versus trying to get these ARCs in the hands of someone influential, whether it's like a social media influencer or
Mm-hmm.
someone like someone who will be maybe photographed publicly with it, or just as like a very influential person like a Condoleezza Rice or something like that. Like, what's kind of your kind of strategy with the book on that front?
Well, what I find is the most prudent thing to do is to pitch people first and see if they're interested. And if they are, then send something to them, because journalists do not like to get things
Yeah, when I was at US
randomly.
News and World Report, like people, they like I asked for a few ARCs, and all of a sudden I got on some list, and
Uh huh.
suddenly they were just like showing up like crazy. It's like I felt bad because
Uh huh.
they were just going in the trash. It's like why not, why wouldn't you just email me first and see if I even want this thing?
Yeah, somebody was telling me the other day, somebody in media was telling me the other day that they got four of the same ARC from a publishing house. And I'm like, that's not great. That's a result of crushing workloads and departments that don't get staffed correctly. Publishing is very much about do more with less. And to that end, I feel like pitching first and then sending saves people money and time. And, about the influential people, a lot of that is just organic. It just happens organically. And there's not a lot you could do to force somebody to carry a book. But, with Instagram and bookstagrammers and book talkers, publishers usually have marketing departments that send out influencer boxes and things like that. So I kind of let them do that part and stick to working with my authors on what ways they're connecting with their audience, and stick to the traditional, sort of media or pitching newsletters and things like that. I do think that the book talk stuff gets misunderstood sometimes, because that is a lot of organic stuff that happens. And when publishers do send the influencer boxes, I can't say that a ton happens for books that way. I think it's more like, you get teenage girls who discover, a book, and they do a TikTok where they're crying about it or something, and it gets like 2 million views. You can't plan that.
Yeah. And just to explain for people what influencer boxes are, it's like a very glitzy. It's not just an ARC. Like you're hiring a designer, someone artsy, to actually put together some kind of themed gift box that has like stuff, like little kitschy stuff that's like related to whatever the book is and everything like that. And so it's meant to be photographed well. It's meant to like be on an Instagram page or a
Yep.
TikTok or something like that. And
Yep.
you're saying that that's not something you really like deal with much.
Not a lot, unless somebody specifically requests it. You know, I publishers, I'm only one person. Publishers have entire marketing departments who have these lists set up and mailers set up and things like that. So I'm like, have at it. That's not where I want to put my energy.
And then obviously a lot of newspapers have like laid off their book reviewers. Like, is
Hmm.
your strategy to go for like what's better? I mean, obviously the answer is it depends, but like a book review or getting a journalist to interview the author and write an article about them and their book or something like that. Like, do you think? How do you think about that? Like, are there many traditional reviewers left out there?
Not a ton, and reviews don't really sell books, which I've written about a lot. I think it's more valuable to have an interview because then people get to really know the author in a different way. It's just not a summary of their book, whether it's good or bad. It's more about their personality, and I think that's very important these days. Again, for connecting with their audiences, the book review conundrum is not going to get better. It will get worse. More book reviews will disappear, and then it's going to be like, so now what do we do? And that's where I think Substack is very valuable in that is a place where more book reviews can live and more book coverage can live, and people can connect with their audiences. But publishing is always like 5 steps behind whatever's happening right now. So I bet if I walked into a publishing house and I talked to sales department and started talking about like Substack coverage, they'd be like, what do you mean?
Hi there, Simon here. So that's the end of the free preview for this episode. If you want to listen to or watch the full episode, you have to become a paid subscriber to my Substack. When you subscribe, you get an automated email that allows you to book a half-hour introductory phone call with me. Subscribers also get the full-length interviews with some of the world's most successful media entrepreneurs. You can watch the video version, read the transcript, or upload the audio feed to your favorite podcast player. To subscribe, go to simonowens.substack.com. That's simonowens.substack.com, or just Google the words Simon Owens and newsletter.